The Federal Reserve is not a neutral institution. It is a machine that quietly transfers value from everyone who earns a paycheck to the people who already own assets, and in 2026, they are trying to make that transfer look like reform. And if you think your savings, your bond portfolio, your cash sitting in a bank account, or your retirement plan are protected because you followed the rules, you are about to learn how rules are written for the winners, not for you. This is financial education, not financial advice. In the next several minutes, I am going to connect a few things that sound unrelated on purpose: the push to weaken or even abolish the Fed, the idea that the United States might move away from the dollar's role in global finance, the reality of rate changes and inflation that never really healed, and the ugly part you will feel in your daily life: housing costs, job displacement from AI, and a retirement system that keeps getting delayed while the price of everything keeps climbing. You are living in 2026 with a special kind of stress. AI is eating middle-class jobs faster than most people can retrain. Interest rates may have stopped rising in a straight line, but your purchasing power is still damaged. Real wages are still stuck behind essentials. Meanwhile, the stock market can hit new highs while ordinary people feel poorer every month. That disconnect is not an accident. It is a design problem. Now here is the first uncomfortable truth. The value of your money is not only decided by inflation, it is decided by who gets access to the financial plumbing when things go wrong. Let me start with an old story, because the lesson never changes. In the past, the United States had a promise that tied the dollar to something outside itself. The dollar was treated as redeemable for gold. That meant the world had a reason to trust the currency. If you held dollars, you could imagine exchanging them for a real asset. That constraint forced discipline. Then the constraint was removed. After that, the dollar was no longer backed by a fixed quantity of gold. It was backed by faith plus power. Faith that policymakers will behave responsibly. Power that the United States can impose its terms on global trade and finance. Once the link to gold was gone, the Federal Reserve became the steering wheel for the dollar's purchasing power. The Fed could raise rates to cool the economy or cut rates to support it. But either way, the Fed's decisions shape who benefits from new money and who eats the cost. Now you might be thinking, that is normal. Central banks do that everywhere. The dark truth is not that central banks exist. The dark truth is what happens when a country runs out of clean options and starts treating other people's trust like an endless resource. In modern times, the United States has a massive debt problem. And debt is not just a number. Debt is a claim on future cash flows. Debt means someone expects interest payments. It means someone expects repayment. It means someone will ask every year, where is my money? The Fed helps the United States manage that pressure. When borrowing gets expensive, the Fed can try to influence financial conditions. When borrowing becomes politically painful, the Fed can sometimes become the pressure valve, and because of the dollar's dominance in global trade, the rest of the world often becomes the unwilling lender. So let's talk about the idea you have heard in political circles: the push to close the Federal Reserve. On paper, it sounds extreme, even cartoonish. You cannot just shut down a financial system that large overnight. But the more important point is not whether the Fed can be fully abolished in one day. The more important point is what it signals. It signals a willingness to change the mechanics of how debt is serviced and how money is valued. If the institution that issues and manages the dollar's liquidity is weakened or removed, the United States still has debt. The interest still has to be paid. The Treasury still needs financing. So what happens next? The answer is simple and brutal. If the system loses its stabilizer, you do not get freedom from debt. You get a faster erosion of the currency's value, and you get more pressure on future payments that nobody wants to actually fund. And here is where the AI layer makes everything worse. In 2026, many middle-class workers are not just worried about inflation, they are worried about their jobs becoming obsolete. AI is not creating the bright future people were promised. It is reducing headcount in support roles, legal review, basic programming, call centers, and even parts of marketing. People can work less, but they still need rent, food, healthcare, and car payments. So when your income is squeezed, your savings matter more. But savings in cash, or in low-yield instruments, become fragile when the value of money is under pressure. And if the policy environment shifts toward weakening the Fed or toward monetization, the fragility turns into a cliff. Now take that concept and apply it to something you already feel: real estate. Housing affordability has detached from wages in the United States and in many developed countries. In the US, in the UK, in Canada, and in Australia. You do not need to be an economist to see it. You just need to try to move. A couple years ago, people were told the market would normalize. They were told to be patient. They were told that rates would come down and affordability would return. But real affordability depends on more than the mortgage rate. It depends on wages, on credit availability, on insurance costs, and on supply constraints. And it depends on whether the currency is quietly losing purchasing power. Even when inflation prints cool numbers on paper, your real costs can keep rising because housing is not only an economic variable, it is a political and structural variable. Insurance markets in some areas are collapsing due to climate-driven losses. That pushes premiums up. Then landlords pass costs down. Then tenants get squeezed. So when you hear political talk about fixing the system, ask yourself what system is actually being fixed. Is it fixing the lives of ordinary people, or is it fixing the math of debt? Now let me give you a micro story, because abstractions are how people get away with this. Picture a 32-year-old nurse named David. He works nights. He picks up extra shifts. He saved cash because he thought he was doing the responsible thing. He bought a small bond fund that promised stability. He also tried to buy a condo because he believed the usual story: pay down principal, build equity, escape rent. Then the cost of living didn't behave like a textbook. Insurance went up. Groceries went up. His wage growth lagged behind his expenses. Meanwhile, the mortgage market adjusted, and the price tags on homes stayed high. David did everything sensible. And yet he still feels like he is running on sand. That is because stability in nominal terms is not stability in real terms. If the purchasing power of money is falling, safe instruments can still be traps. Now remember David's bond fund. In a world where debt management becomes more aggressive, bond investors can face a nasty reality. Bond prices can fall when markets reprice inflation expectations or when they fear monetization. You might not lose everything overnight, but you can lose enough to break a plan, and if you are using bonds to survive, you do not need a crash, you need a steady deterioration. Now, about the Fed again. There is also a second political idea floating around, changing how the dollar fits into the global system. You have probably heard the word Bitcoin in this context. Some people frame it as anti-government freedom, others frame it as a hedge against fiat collapse. In 2026, the reality is more uncomfortable. Crypto did not become a clean escape from institutions. Regulation happened. Institutional money arrived, and the biggest holders are often not retail investors with dreams. They are large firms with risk models, custody arrangements, and political influence. So when someone says the United States will move toward Bitcoin, ask a simple question: what happens to debt in the meantime? If the United States substitutes the dollar for Bitcoin globally, it might reduce the dollar's dominance. But it does not erase the obligation to service existing liabilities. Debt does not vanish because a narrative changes. Also, in practice, any switch would be messy and partial. Businesses do not replace an invoicing currency overnight. Contracts exist. Payment rails exist. Central banks have reserves. It is not one press conference. But even if the transition is slow, the mere threat of change can alter behavior today. And behavior changes money values today. That brings us to something that has been happening in the background: growing pressure to diversify away from the dollar. Sometimes this shows up as official policy. Sometimes it shows up as informal preference. Sometimes it shows up as countries allowing alternatives for trade settlement. In the transcript you gave, there is a claim that some U.S. states recognize gold as a currency. Even if the exact details vary from what people say online, the general mechanism matters. Parts of the system begin to talk about alternative value stores when trust in the dollar feels shaky. Now, do not confuse symbolism with power. A state cannot instantly dethrone the global role of a currency, but states can build legal frameworks. They can influence local policy. They can create incentives. And incentives matter because money follows liquidity. If enough people believe an asset will retain value better during monetary instability, they shift demand. Demand pushes prices. Higher prices can discourage the spending of that asset, but it can also help it function as a hedge inside a portfolio. This is why gold comes up again and again. Gold does not produce cash flow like stocks, and it does not pay dividends like shares. But it has a different kind of utility. It is hard to print, and it is historically hard to debase within a short time frame. So when policymakers or political leaders flirt with weakening the Fed, you should understand what the public hears and what markets anticipate. The public hears freedom or reform. Markets hear risk. And when markets hear risk, they adjust the pricing of everything: bonds, currencies, commodities, and equity risk premiums. Now here is the next cliffhanger, and it is the part most people do not connect to their daily stress. In 2026, the Fed's decisions are not happening in a vacuum. They are happening inside a global debt ecosystem. Total global debt has exceeded $300 trillion. That is not a typo. 300 trillion. When the system has that much debt, small changes in interest rates and liquidity can have outsized effects, and it also means that there is less room for policy error. If borrowing costs rise too fast, defaults spread. If rates stay too high, growth slows and unemployment rises. If rates fall too fast, inflation expectations can reignite. And if policymakers turn to monetization, the purchasing power of the currency can erode. This is the trap. Every option has a cost. The cost just moves around between groups, and the groups most insulated from the cost are usually the groups with assets. If you own real estate outright, or you own a diversified portfolio of stocks and bonds, or you have access to credit on favorable terms, you can sometimes ride out monetary shocks. If you earn a paycheck and your retirement plan is mostly low-yield assets, you cannot. Your options are limited. So when you watch wealth concentration accelerate in 2026, ask yourself if that pattern makes sense. If the top 1% owns more than ever, they are positioned to capture the gains from asset inflation. And if ordinary people are stuck with wages and rent, they bear most of the loss from currency instability. That is not luck. It is distribution. Now let's get more specific about the mechanics of debt and why markets behave strangely in some rate environments. You may have heard that when the Fed raises interest rates, it helps prevent inflation. That is the theory. But the theory assumes that debtors can actually pay. What if the debtor cannot pay in real terms? What if the debtor needs to refinance continuously? What if the cash flow doesn't cover interest? Then raising rates can backfire. It can increase the interest burden and make refinancing harder. It can push the system into a cycle where the debtor keeps borrowing just to roll the debt. So you end up with an environment where short-term borrowing is done at high yields, because investors demand compensation for risk. But long-term borrowing becomes expensive or illiquid, because investors do not believe repayment is reliable far into the future. This is why you can see a situation where investors will lend to the United States for shorter periods but demand higher compensation, while long-dated Treasury demand can soften. It is a signal, and in 2026, a lot of investors are already thinking about how policies could shift. They watch political proposals, they watch appointments, they watch rhetoric about the Fed, they watch whether fiscal plans become more expansionary or more restrained. Now, if that uncertainty grows, the cost of financing rises. And once financing becomes expensive, the political temptation is to reduce the real burden by changing the currency value. That is not a conspiracy, that is math. If a government's debt is nominal and the currency's purchasing power falls, then the real burden of that debt can decrease for the debtor. However, the real cost is imposed on whoever holds the currency or whoever earns fixed income compensation. This is why inflation came down can feel like a lie. Inflation can cool while purchasing power keeps deteriorating because wages and retirement incomes adjust slower than prices. Also, in many cases, inflation in essentials like housing and healthcare does not fully reverse. Now, pattern interrupt. Stop and think about your own habits. If you keep cash in a checking account earning near zero returns, you are not being safe. You are making a bet against the purchasing power of money. You are betting that the real value of your cash will hold. But the moment the policy environment shifts toward weaker monetary control, that bet can stop being rational. Not because someone stole your money, because the currency itself becomes cheaper. This is the part people refuse to face. You can be a good person, follow every rule, work hard, and still get financially harmed because the system changed how value is measured. Now let's connect this to AI displacement, because it makes this story personal. Imagine a call center agent who lost their job to AI-assisted automation. In the past, they might have been able to retrain for a different customer service role. In 2026, the new roles are fewer. The new roles often require experience with systems and data, or they are outsourced, or they disappear into AI operations, so they take a lower-paying job. Their wage stagnates, their emergency fund shrinks, their ability to ride out financial volatility collapses. Then, if housing costs rise or insurance premiums rise due to climate-driven events, they do not have margin anymore. And when you do not have margin, every macro decision becomes a crisis. So if the United States changes its monetary policy direction, the effect will not show up first in a Wall Street chart. It will show up first in your bank account. Your rent will go up, your food cost will go up, your insurance will go up, your medical bills will not care about the Fed press conference, your paycheck will still arrive. That is why threats to the Fed are not just abstract, they are an alarm about how value might be transferred. Now we also need to address the political story around reform and cleaning up corruption. Many people hear such talk and assume it means less manipulation. But often it means more manipulation, just rebranded. There is a cynical pattern in financial history. When policymakers cannot reduce deficits by cutting spending or raising taxes effectively, they shift to methods that reduce the real value of liabilities or increase the real value of inflows. Sometimes the inflow is external. That means changing who pays. In the transcript you provided, there is a concept of debt strategy evolving in versions. While not every detail is accurate or verifiable, the broader logic is real. Countries with large financial power have historically leveraged that power by attracting global capital, investing it, and paying returns. But if the country becomes less trusted, or if the investment engine becomes less productive, then the returns demanded increase and the political willingness to finance decreases. So the country must find a new way to fund deficits. If it cannot attract enough capital voluntarily at reasonable rates, then it leans on a different lever: coercion, regulation, tariffs, security arrangements, or financial pressure. This is where the three color groups framing comes in. Countries that cooperate receive favorable treatment. Countries that stay neutral get complicated trade terms. Countries that confront face higher costs. Whether or not that exact classification exists as described, the underlying mechanism is observable. Trade policy and financial policy are linked, investors are not neutral. And when geopolitical risk rises, capital flows behave differently. Now, do not miss the detail that matters for you. When trade costs rise, those costs rarely stay with corporations.